Again, hello, welcome everyone. I'm Debbie Lacey with Eastside For All. Welcome to Build for Belonging. As we explore place and placemaking today, let us acknowledge the first peoples of this place. Our region lies on the unceded and ancestral land of the Coast Salish, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Snoqualmie, Stillaguamish, and the Suquamish people. We honor and give thanks to the first peoples past, present, and future, and to the land itself. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. You can learn more about the indigenous communities connected to specific geographic regions at the Native Land Digital website that I know many of you are familiar with. The creators say that their hope is to improve the relationship of people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with the land around them and with the real history and sacredness of that land. Let us also recognize that acknowledgements such as mine today are not replacements for authentic relationship building and the practice of centering the needs and contributions of our Indigenous communities. After our guest speaker's presentation, thank you, you'll be able to join small group conversations to share your connections to the topic and your ideas. So we really look forward to getting you all talking with one another and sharing. So for those of you who are able, please have your cameras on to help me welcome our speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Jenn Lowe, Associate Design Director at Openbox. Jenn is an integrative designer, educator, and landscape architect with over 13 years of experience in the planning and design of public spaces across New York, California, and here in Washington. At Openbox, Jenn is interested in the intersection of human-centered design and the built environment and sees both design research and the power of place as key tools to advance our work toward justice and equity. She's a Chinese-American woman born and raised in East King County by her immigrant parents who still reside here. Jenn holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture degree from UW and a Master of Design and Integrative Design from the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. Let's all wave and welcome Jenn in. Thank you, Jenn, for being here.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for the lovely introduction and having me and Openbox here today. I am going to share my screen to make sure everyone can see okay. Is everything working all right?
Yes, looks good, Jenn. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So yes, hi everyone. I'm Jenn Lowe from Associate Design Director from Openbox. I want to thank Debbie and Eastside for All for the opportunity to talk about Openbox's practices and process. We met Debbie by way of our own exploratory research of community voices in and around Seattle and King County area, and also being born and raised in East King County. And I'm actually sitting right now in Redmond at my parents' house this week, so it's perfect timing. All of this work uh, hits particularly close to home, both personally and professionally, as a practitioner for many years, also as a landscape architect in and around the Seattle area. Um, as particular, I'm really excited about also Eastside for All's Build for Belonging as a program series right now, as we at Openbox believe the cultivation of belonging in place and space is really a fundamental attribute of the work we do in our studio, designed for equity. As a kid growing up in Issaquah of immigrant parents, feelings and observations of belonging and disbelonging were very visceral to me as we moved through different spaces across my life. So, from predominantly white suburban neighborhood just off of Westlake Sammamish Parkway in Issaquah, to spending our weekends in an international district, to buying groceries and spending time with my family also in Vancouver and Richmond, British Columbia. So given that my own lived experience has taken central role in how I see the built environment and us collectively as a team at Openbox, our unifying motivation is the value of lived experience in the planning and design of our neighborhoods as core to this work. Because those who are directly impacted by neighborhood change should be at the decision-making table. So a little bit more about our studio. We are an interdisciplinary Black and women-led studio of diverse lived experience. We're composed of a team of creatives in research, design, we're urbanists, we're activists, and we're also educators. And our studio is located in Red Hook, a neighborhood of Brooklyn, which sits on the unceded land of Lenape people. Red Hook, as a neighborhood, is also home to New York City's first Puerto Rican neighborhoods. It's also home to Brooklyn's largest public housing development, and it's also a place of intense climate vulnerability. And we really, our office and studio sits right at the edge of, of the water's edge in Red Hook. And a little bit about our approach and process. So we design for people, cities, and planet. As I noted earlier, we bring lived experience directly to the designer's table. Our version of community engagement is not a couple of post-it note sessions or a couple of, box checking exercises, but we are intentional about constructing entire phases of work that integrate and deepen planning and design processes. So we apply deeply qualitative research methods to engage with communities to surface their lived experience, visions, aspirations, and needs. And most importantly, we are taking these insights and synthesizing these learnings into actionable insights, design principles, and opportunities that feed into design and development projects. So all of our services are very much interconnected, but we are a design and research-based studio, and we engage in both the visible and invisible forms of design and design processes. So community engagement, and you'll learn more about what we mean when we talk about what community engagement is as practice. Communications design, experience and service design, partnerships and ventures, and also a myriad of qualitative and quantitative research methods in order to do this work. I'd like to share a couple of case studies with you all today, but first I want to shift and you all sort of to be viewing these projects within the lens in which we approach our work and process by first sharing our approach to design justice in summary of 5 core principles. The first is center communities and not individuals. So at Openbox, we centered the collective good and not individual benefit. And that requires new systems and processes to be built to disconnect from the status quo processes that cater to individual exclusionary interests. And to do this, we consider how community ecosystems are the unit of sustainable living and how local development and knowledge sharing builds power within communities. Our second principle is design how and why and not just what. So we're not just focusing solely on what's the thing that gets built in any given project, but we're designing for ever evolving possibilities for how and why people come together long after the designer is really out of a picture or after that building is built. And I would also kind of put it a lens in addition to, I think, who is a really important question to be asked also that demands specificity in enabling work in equity. We recognize that communities are dynamic systems. People, identities, and cultures are fluid, and there are many communities within a given community where there's both shared values at points and there's also conflict and tension. So, in order to really do this aspect and these parts of this work, we consider how the design of shared spaces informs how we choose to come together and what we imagine we can become and also modal definitions of stakeholders, users, and community members can surface new possibilities. Being able to really articulate who is part of these processes, who are our constituents, our stakeholders, our audiences is core to this work as well. We honor lived experience over design experience. So we deeply believe that people and their communities are experts of their lived experience, and they provide local contextual insight and define a community's terms of engagement. And we create space for people to share their own modes of participation and uplift what is already happening and working in communities. So, key considerations in order to do this work, how we can see how design amplifies local stories and empowers community members, and how we can allow communities to really interpret welcome through design cues they experience. So it's really sort of turning the tables of decentering designer and recentering the community as expertise and of this work. And we also believe in excellence without supremacy. So supremacy narrowly defines what excellence and success looks like, and as a result, power, resources, and opportunities are stockpiled for some at the exclusion of many. And we believe that in removing supremacy means democratizing who defines, measures, and enjoys design excellence. So to do this, we consider how inclusive definitions of language, success metrics, and standards are valuable, and is valued as design outcomes. And we also want to really embed sustainable infrastructure, and consider how that is inclusive in investing in racial and economic equity in respective design and development projects. And lastly, the all of this work is always a work in progress. Justice is an ongoing process, not an outcome. It's not a checklist. It's not a box checking exercise, and we cannot define outcomes that way. Um, and we're really trying to carve paths, and it's iterative, and we're constantly improving sort of our methods and practices and processes towards that. And so we must consider really how inclusive design processes increase the potential for equitable outcomes, and the ongoing care of relationships and partnerships is part of the design process. And that is sort of, continuing to evolve, continued maintenance is really relationship building in this work. So given sort of those principles, I'll kind of carry you through like what this actually looks like in our practice and in our work, in tangible, physical, visual ways. And I'll just kind of caveat this also in the respects to this conversation. These projects are different in type and scale that may look different in your respective placekeeping work, but intrinsically interrelated. So there'll be points of connection in this conversation I'd like you all to consider relative to process and findings that were derived from these processes to inform design and planning decisions. So I'll be highlighting two particular projects. The first is in collaboration with Washington, D.C.'s DC Public Library System. And the second is a case study that was in partnership with the San Francisco Planning Department. So we framed this first project at the DC Public Library was how might we champion local voices in exhibition design? With the modernization of a landmark building in Washington, D.C. This is a Mies van der Rohe building. It's been a DC public library. It's located in City Center, if you're familiar with Washington, D.C. It's the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. It had gone a major renovation over the past few years, and they wanted to create a new exhibit space that would be the home for local DC stories, past and present. And to ensure that the design of this exhibit really met the needs and hopes of the community members specifically. So the DC Public Library sought Openbox to engage them through an intensive community engagement and research process. So key audiences for this research sort of emerged early in our project stakeholder interviews. So repeatedly, the groups that we really wanted to engage in this work were local teens, longtime residents, and local creatives. And we centered these investigations around really trying to want to better understand like potential design directions and also to identify particular groups that we can spread the impact of the exhibit work to broader audiences and networks across the district. And when we embark on our research, our first phase is really uncovering community needs, and this respects was like around like what does it mean to tell DC centered stories and DC voices and DC identities. And we kind of it was kind of a multi-level approach to our research. We visited DC museums and cultural institutions to observe the landscape of exhibit design in the city. We create interactive installations inside the library to understand how does the community perceive the role of the library. And we conducted what we call intercept interviews, which is kind of like a man on the street. We ourselves kind of go into museums and spaces and have conversations about what is particularly compelling about different exhibits across different DC museums or cultural institutions. And we also created co-creation opportunities to better understand and have dialogue around what makes a DC story. For instance, I think these end up being sort of opportunities to provoke a conversation and not get explicit directive answers, but be more generative. For instance, there's this little bottle of mambo sauce that you see on the image on the right. And it was really interesting to hear from voices who were connected to the mambo sauce as seeing it as a really explicit, direct correlation to telling the DC story and as sort of a symbol of DC and why. And those who don't really necessarily have connections to mambo sauce and didn't see how that sauce like resonated with them or the DC story. So being able to unpack sort of the generative nature of the why of it through conversation was really important. And like through that type of research at the very sort of beginnings, we developed the following design principles for the development of a future exhibit concept or the subsequent exhibit design concept work. And I'll read through all 5 of these design concepts that emerged from that research. So the first one is cultivate belonging. So the exhibit must proactively countervail the widespread exclusion of Black DC residents to demonstrate that they are welcome and that this space is intended for them. So while the museum was really designed by Mies van der Rohe, he was really fundamentally deprioritized altogether as a noteworthy figure to highlight in the library's historical narrative, and really championing like local voices that were really prioritized came out of that early sort of co-creation exploration. The second design principle that emerged too was celebrating living culture. So to acknowledge that Chocolate City is not erased and honor the significance of Black culture in DC, the exhibit should present a culture that continues to live and breathe rather than as a relic of the past. The third design principle was ground in the everyday. So this was talking about the leveraging the relatability of everyday stories to engage people with history and more readily apply lessons to the present. Number 4 was facilitate dialogue that empowers displaced voices, elevate the concerns of impacted communities with those who are impacting them. And the last design principle for the exhibit concepts was to equip for endurance, provide practical capacity building and emotional support for people seeking to uplift themselves and their communities. So all of these directives really kind of were able to channel through the design team. We worked with a team of architects, graphic designers, exhibit designers that channeled sort of like these insights as well as content insights as well. And so through this work, we were able to iteratively with participants be able to come to the table with some concepts and particular content around Mary and Barry, around go-go music, around MLK and the Poor People's Campaign. And also from starting having those conversations about sort of community interaction and interface with exhibits and the participatory elements, we're able to put together some different types of exhibits to test what sort of successful sort of community interaction points may be for these exhibits as well. Um, and we, prototyping for us is doing this in real time, and it's about conversation. We're not asking specifically about, colors, where this layout should be, what style this wants. We're talking about content, angles for stories, the narratives, how people are receiving the information and interacting with the information. So this particular prototype around Mayor Barry, we wanted to know what angles on the Barry story resonated with local residents. How do people react to first person stories through audio? And how do we solicit stories from the community? So in perpetuity, community members are really part of the storytelling curation process. And around go-go music, what about DC music are visitors interested in learning? And what musical experiences are most engaging in the context of an exhibition design like this? And so through our research, we met a wide range of DC residents over multiple rounds of this research. Through these activities, through these interviews, through conversations, and using the use of prototypes, having something and bringing something to the table to be able to facilitate these conversations and dialogue. Focusing on key audiences. And then also we did broaden quite a bit to all library users as well throughout sort of the course of, of this work. And a quick look at this research process by the numbers, we observed five DC museums and cultural institutions early in the research, engaged with 12 local library branches. We conducted 12 in-depth interviews and 66 intercept interviews, and conducted a total of 40 group activities with local teams. And as a final deliverable and outcome of this work, after 8 months of this generative design research and prototyping process, we delivered to the library blueprints and a guidebook to provide a framework for community engagement and a 5-year plans for all key exhibit experiences to sustain and elevate a community-centered exhibit within the MLK library. And we have a great relationship with the library. And I think subsequent to this work, they're really interested in evaluating sort of the post-construction and opening of the exhibits. So they're investigating further scope to be able to see like what we learned from the community was directly fed into the design process. And there is commitment of follow-up to having an evaluation process, to see sort of where we went right, maybe things that we need to continue to iterate on or improve on as well. And the second and last case study I wanted to share takes us to the West Coast in San Francisco. And our driving question was, how might we use data to tell human stories? And this was in the context of a partnership with a partnership with the San Francisco Planning Department. We were asked to pilot a way to share Parklet's program data publicly and increase awareness of this work. This was a collaboration with Openbox and Stay, which is another Openbox a venture and a partner in civic data management. And so for this pilot, we studied parklets, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with parklets, especially over the past sort of year and a half, as they emerged predominantly as spaces of retail and cafe seating over the course of the pandemic. But it did emerge from the Parking Day sort of initiative that started in San Francisco, I think back in 2005. That has proliferated really across the country and across the globe, which is these curbside parking spaces transformed by citizens into public amenities like pedestrian seating, bicycle parking, greenery, and arts. And so this was like a shorter project, a collaboration. It was a month long, where we combined qualitative research with quantitative data, existing quantitative data, to gain a deeper understanding of the impact of parklets in San Francisco, to both residents and businesses, and then also subsequently publish the results onto an online interactive format designed to inform and inspire the public. So San Francisco Planning Department has a specific interest in public space as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. To understand how public spaces reflect and influence neighborhood diversity, so future land use decisions can lead to more equitable and inclusive human outcomes. So, with this in mind, we embarked on this quantitative and qualitative journey to this project. We collected quantitative data from public life data warehouses and also public life study methods. Um, for instance, like similar to the Gale Institute, where you are counting, the number of folks who are in a space, who are sitting down, who may be crossing paths, and so forth in any given public space, and complementing and deepening that with the integration of ethnographic research methods, what we call provotypes, which is basically a play on the words of provoke and prototype. The idea is like we're not looking at a prototype, specifically a test, but it's to provoke, to create a conversation and imagination to get to a different place, more about visions and strategies and needs and desires. And also continuing our use of intercepts, so the man on the street, participant, being the participant, observer, and conversation. And also my favorite is personal tours. Getting a tour of a particular space from the perspective of someone who actually is using the space themselves, and not the designer, not the planner, the person every day that has to interface that space. And this is just a glimpse, just for information and reference, and like how like the process of what our design research endeavor looks like. We really start with the planning stage is really alignment, getting the team at the table, the project stakeholders at the table to understand what are the key learning objectives of this endeavor for us. And then we embark on the research and uh, our synthesis, and some likely two parts of our research is that sort of understanding community needs, and surfacing those insights, and then a subsequent research endeavor of a prototype or a prototype of some sort, to deepen those insights and further develop that work, and have ideation phases and design work where we're really driving what those insights were into tangible principles, guidance, frameworks, or a roadmap to what to do next and what this means for any given particular project. And so, I mentioned before, the data came through the outcome of all of this work over that month came in the form of a data story microsite, kind of like a story map. Some of you may be familiar with story maps through GIS. We published this on San Francisco's Planning's website and demonstrates the tangible positive impacts of the Parklet program by complementing data trends with the data analysis, information visualization insights, and direct quotes from conversations with San Francisco residents and businesses. And so I'll walk through a few snapshots of some of the content showcased on this microsite. Um, First is from Gwen, a weekly Parklet user. Um, Note that also 82% of homes near a parklet are apartments. And she noted that the parklet gets me to come out. It's my cheers. And we highlighted a parklet collaboration with the local Merchants Association, and the people of Parkside Sunset to support the district's long-term goal of revitalizing the Taraval business corridor. And a quote from Ken, a local restaurant owner, noted, "As a business, I think it's really all worth the trade-off. What's two parking spaces? It's a benefit to us." And we also spotlighted a parklet collaboration between the Exploratorium Museum and a Buena Vista Horace Mann Middle School, co-designed with neighborhood youth, community advisors, and science experts. And this provided an informal STEM education resource for the Spanish-speaking communities of the Mission District. The idea of a rain gauge tracking the data, collecting the data, and then comparing it to the previous year's data was an idea that came from the science teachers at the school. A quote from Eric, a Parklet sponsor. And so also through these conversations and interviews and intercepts, we learned about the experiences from veteran Parklet sponsors to increase transparency, also about the challenges of the program and to share tactics about success. The city also shared its perspective, including the pros and cons of introducing regulation and the values that drive them. And all of this content we were able to share on this microsite as well. And by providing really an in-depth look at the impact of parklets, San Francisco Planning hopes to really encourage a greater diversity of people to sponsor parklets and bring their benefits to the communities. And within the broader impacts beyond San Francisco, how can this also really inform this larger landscape of parklet programs that which really have infiltrated many of our cities and neighborhoods, and how can we make them more inclusive and impactful across sort of different initiatives and different parklet initiators. And given that, that is my last case study. So I really appreciate your time, everyone. I'm going to create a little bit of space now for any questions or comments that you may have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen. We did have a couple of questions posted in the chat and encourage people to continue posting things there. And if you don't have access to the chat, I'm going to allow you to just speak up and share your question in just a moment. First, we're going to go with Kim's question, which is, how did you develop the driving question for each project?
It is a great question, and that happens very early in the process. So between even the proposal, I'll back up a little bit. We see our clients too as partners. And so when we get into the proposal writing phase, that is a really core opportunity to collectively have alignment on what is sort of our core goal in this partnership. And there may be sort of nuances and there be, subsequent learning objectives that come through there, but that comes at the scope writing. And we also then facilitate as the first part of that process alignment. So getting the stakeholder team at the table and having and interviewing them. What do they want to get out of this? And from those conversations, whether it be 5 conversations, 10 conversations, 2 conversations, are able to really drive some sort of common core learning objectives from those conversations.
Thank you.
And Dexter had a question, and then I'll open it up in just a moment, folks. So if you can't get to the chat, we're going to ask you to share your question live. Dexter shared that he loves the dynamic nature of the design, incorporation of broad relevant feedback, designing for lived experience, and of course, inclusivity. He asked, what are the key indicators that something needs to or ought to be redesigned? It's a good question.
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. That needs to be redesigned, should be redesigned. I think I just think always of how many things should be redesigned, and I look at all things to be redesigned. This is from I think when something sparks a question, and this is very much from maybe me speaking as Jen and maybe not speaking as Openbox right now, I think as a designer, I think when questions arise in terms of accessibility, that to me becomes a really driving design question. If I see certain people in a space, if I don't see someone in a space, I want to know why and what sort of is driving those scenarios and that from happening.
That's great to think about that. So places where we start to notice barriers to access or inequitable access, we might question the design itself and wonder if that's an opportunity for a redesign at that time. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Sudeshna asks, what kind of resistance, if any, do you face when you start such a project?
Also, these are all really great questions. The resistance to these projects are often, well, we have a business model about, centering community voices and community stories. And that is something that I think for a lot of folks, they have a hard time putting a value to that work. When if you need to solve a problem, you need to fix something. How is this really, need the problem to be solved? Solving. um, and it is an invisible practice in much like relationship building, partnership building, process. All of these things are invisible. We go through them all the time. We do it all the time, so we know it's part of our work. Um, Challenging how we go through those processes or who we talk to as being a fundamental sort of direct correlation to better outcomes is something we continue to be challenged by. And I think what we do at case studies like this and creating more case studies out of our work is a huge sort of aspect of how can we create this sort of collection of proof points to demonstrate comfort, risk taking, opportunities to challenge existing systems and processes. Because ultimately, that's kind of what our work is based in, is challenging and coming up with new things and new processes where and challenging the status quo processes.
It's almost make me think that resistance is probably part of the process because of that, right? Because you are challenging status quo, you're inviting the community to take risks, inviting the powers that be to take risks. And so it would seem that that would be something that we would want to collectively embrace as not a forever roadblock, but just part of the process. Maybe that those resistances will show up. This is a thought. Dori is asking about super blocks. What are your thoughts? You mentioned the parklets. So what about super blocks?
I think it's been a while since I've been a landscape architect too. It's been a few years. Can I have more context about the super block definition?
Yeah, Joy, you want to come off mute and
Sure.
share?
So I myself, I'm just sort of have heard about super blocks. And so I've heard that they're used in Barcelona quite a bit,
Mm,
and they sort of limit road use and bring back more sort of pedestrian use. So as far as safety
mm.
for um, against traffic. So, I admit I don't know that much, but it really sounds like an interesting idea. And if anybody else knows about super blocks, I'd love to hear that.
Debbie. Yeah, Debbie.
Yes,
John
John.
Stokes, Bellevue. We have super blocks in Bellevue. It was designed that way. Is a really neat idea to get traffic certain places. And
Mm, mhm,
what we're finding, and I think this kind of answer to it, is that
mhm,
something we thought was really neat 30 years ago is a
mm,
real deterrent somewhat to a current development and getting around. So one of the things the city's been working on for some time now in downtown is finding ways to uh, get through in the middle, and making
mm,
sure we design things so that it's more walkable. The
mhm,
city was built with super blocks for cars. I mean, that's the baseline for it. And things have changed. And I think the answer to this is super blocks are like anything else that were really great at one time. Sometimes things just change in development, and you have to be able to And then you have a choice. Do you keep going on the other way because that's what we did, what we always do, or we do something different? So we're working on that aspect. But it's a great, concept to look at because it affects a lot of other things too. Same thing.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, John, and Joy too. I think now I'm sort of recollecting, especially with the Barcelona prompt. Now I'm like, I know what superblocks are. That's super helpful framing. And I would say to that, and I think it's similar to sort of parklets too, or these initiatives or sort of theoretical frameworks that were developed by designers. They are design centered. They are sort of tools or interventions that have been developed. And I think that's great as a foundation that we have those expertise and know those different sort of proposals and methods of intervention. And I think where our sort of approach comes into play is since we do center sort of the community voice, in what ways does that super block or the idea of the super block work for any given residences and why? And in what ways could it be a sort of a detriment? So it ends up being this shift of being like, it becomes sort of a prototype in itself of like, how can we imagine this working for us? How can it not? And I think then we can maybe see the community as being designers of sort of taking that concept and making it sort of beneficial, or maybe it's a hybrid or a mixture of different sort of concepts. What we try to do, and I think it also becomes a challenge too within our design spaces, designers do want to control it. And we do think that we know best. And then how can we sort of be able to know that we have a toolkit and we know a bunch of ideas, but how can we center community voices and residents and being able to themselves being able to design them to accommodate sort of what are the particular sort of very specific contextual needs of any given neighborhood or city too, or region.
Hi,
I'm
Debbie.
going to
Hi, Debbie.
combine.
I got a
Oh,
couple.
sorry.
Yeah, this one point to the point that we just discussing of super blocks. Well, you absolutely, John mentioned there's a reason for having super blocks for cars, but Bellevue has been trying to work very hard to, not to make it walkable, livable. So we have pedestrian corridors. That's one thing that we try to put in. The other one is how to break up the super block. It's maybe using sky bridges, or perhaps using, again, pedestrian corridor. The idea is to have future buildings to make as connection as shops, stores, pedestrian friendly restaurants, activities, but you have to get to it. So to get to it, maybe sky bridges, and we are having some sky bridges now, and maybe I might thought is underground pedestrian crosswalks, so that we can connect people from mid blocks. But these are the things that maybe architecturally or design-wise, you can be more creative to come up with things that would make it work better. But these are big challenges. We welcome what you can do. Second question I was asking, I think Jen mentioned about bringing stakeholders, talking to people. It's very important. But the key to stakeholders is that how do we bring the non-traditional folks that we want to listen to the table? That's my question. How do we bring stakeholders, particularly those who are not normally engaged, to the table?
It's a really good question, Conrad. And that is finding ways in how we can personally go to those who are not typically engaged. And I say this sort of as a very, the status quo forum of the Wednesday night at 5 o'clock, there's a public meeting for 2 hours across town. And if it's a conversation about accessible public transportation, obviously you're not going to get the folks that need to be there at the table. So how, especially so looking at sort of our work is like, how are we building things that we find out who is not there? What are the gaps from this conversation currently? And how do we then curate meetings, activities, workshops, conversations with folks? And where do we physically go in order to enable those conversations? there is definitely work that we have to do to, deploy and recruit. So that becomes a much more nuanced and strategic way to think about community engagement too. Is that, you get what you get by design. And if we've designed a very limited sort of way to have public voices heard, and then also in those constrained ways, highlights very few, those three very loud voices, then we kind of get what we pay for from those strategies.
And what about having conversations like we're having right now?
This
We're
is a
getting
great
groups
way.
together like this.
Yeah,
It's
that's a
part
great
of
way too. I mean, Debbie we've had these conversations too. I mean, I have a lot of different organizing groups that I'm a part of as well, and many of you do too, where you go to the events, like you go to, you know, things that are already happening, to have conversation, to build a relationship. I in here in Washington D.C. where I live, I'm also part of a Chinatown group, and really first 6 months of my work is really, being available, being there during your storytelling events, being able to hang out and have lunch. Very sort of human aspects, right? We're all neighbors too. Mhm.
So I just wanted to make sure that anyone that didn't have an opportunity to post or wasn't able to post a question in the chat, if you'd like to share one out loud, please don't be shy and go ahead and speak up. Anybody have any question that you didn't get to share? Who hasn't already spoken? I do think that Joy's kind of follow-up question to that about stakeholders is important. So I think I heard someone, so I'm going to check on that in just a moment. But Jen, if you could think about, what is your and / Openbox's definition of a stakeholder? And was someone trying to speak and I talked over you there for a moment?
Oh, yeah. Hi, Debbie. It's
Hi.
Brooke. I can yeah, I did have a quick question. So.
Sure. Let me get Jen's thoughts about her definition of a stakeholder, and then we'll go right over to you. Thanks.
Mhm. We see the stakeholders being those who have decision-making power and those also who should have decision-making power. So ours is that trajectory of like we have the project stakeholders. Our next step is really finding who are those other stakeholders that really should be part of this conversation that they're often not part of that. Mhm.
Okay, great. And then let's go back to that last question there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was trying to think about how to frame this. This might be, I think sort of one of the challenges in co-creation, right, is obviously ceding control, right? And particularly if you're part of any really institution or agency, the notion that you would give over funds or resources or time or whatever to somebody who is not, directly, accountable to you, right? They're not your employee or your staff or something like that is a challenging notion. And so I'm curious if you can speak to like maybe offer one or two pieces of advice about the best way to help people get comfortable with ceding control to the community.
Great question, Brooke. It's something that, yeah, we are interested in also having that conversation because I think one thing that comes to mind is capacity building, right? So if government officials sort of like sort of these more powerful institutions who are probably further away to directly engaging with residents and knowing the issues of that particular neighborhood or city, community leaders and organizations are dialed into that. So in many respects, it helps them be able to, strengthen the organizations, the people who are already leading that work, who support, their own residents, which creates sort of a better network and less of a burden, right? For, I think, these larger entities to have to take on. I think there definitely is this fear of like too many voices often people have. They're like, oh, what if we get conflicting information? What if we get conflicting priorities, too many ideas, too many asks from people? Um, and I feel like if there's a more of a collectivity perspective, there's ways for them to be able to champion and, you know, feed into leadership that thereby is able to, you know, support their own constituencies. So I think to me, I think it's a reframing too of that conversation of this like less of an overwhelming thing, but you're actually empowering and creating more sort of autonomous leadership by being able to know the larger ecosystem of like community stakeholders.
Thank you, Jen. We had another question about policy, and I actually want to reserve that a little bit for our next step, and it's a great transition question. So I'm going to put a pause to the questions that are coming in. Thank you all for participating in that. Special thank you to Jenn Lowe for being here, for the work of Openbox, for taking your time today to share with us. We really, really appreciated it. Jen's invited to stay if she can. Welcome to go if you need to, but I do want to thank her and talk with you all about our next steps this afternoon and the rest of our program. So thank you, Jenn. Give Jenn a wave in case she has to go.
Thank you.
I think
I'd love
so
to stick
much has
around.
been sparked by this conversation. Thank you, Jenn. Really, really appreciate it. I think it's really new for us as a community, I think, to especially cross-sector to be talking about these kind of topics, particularly designing for equity. And so I like the way that we're bringing people together and that you're all asking such great questions, right? About, you know, who are the stakeholders? How do you engage across different perspectives and people? And how do you do that in an equitable way that's truly inclusive and that leads you to something that is designed in a way that wouldn't have the opportunity to be designed otherwise? And I think about this with the broader context of placemaking and how placemaking doesn't start at the design concept. Placemaking starts at the relationship between cities and their communities, between sectors, between individuals. So, you know, in that spirit, I do want to get you all connected and talking with one another. And I want you to begin thinking about being in the practice of this. We are forming a community here. I'll talk a little bit later about a community of practice around placemaking and equity. And designing for equity. So those of you that can stay, I'd like to share what we're going to be doing next is breaking out into these groups. And I'm going to invite Heather or Celia, my awesome volunteers, to let me know if they can't see the screen. But in a moment, you'll be able to choose one of these 5 to do a little deeper dive. And my charge to each of you that's remaining on the call today is to a little bit of homework, which is to find at least one person, someone that you don't already know, or maybe someone that you've never talked to about these kind of things, and get their contact information before you leave today. Make a commitment to, at some point in the rest of the summer, reach out to them, whether it's a phone call or a safe way to get together in person, and have a conversation about placemaking, about what you've been learning and exploring just here today, or if you also came to our last one. So you'll get to pick if you want to talk more about placemaking related to parks and outdoor spaces, creative and art spaces, economic development, urban planning, or community centers, spaces for gathering, celebrating, learning, providing services and support. So of course, these are fluid as far as the boundaries between these, but just for the purposes of getting people together and focusing in on certain aspects, we're going to talk about it in these ways. And I did want to let you know that there's a Padlet. Some of you that came last time, you're familiar with this. And Heather, if she hasn't already, we'll put that in the chat for you. This is something that you can explore as we're gathering into these different groups. So give everybody a little bit of time to get settled into the groups that they want to be in. And while we're doing that, you can take a look at the Padlet and the things that are coming up, resources, information, just people's ideas about these different aspects of placemaking. So when you get into your groups, you're going to go by order, starting in using your alphabetical order from your first name. And then just take a minute each to share anything that you're interested in exploring with others about this topic of placemaking, about designing for equity. And it's just an open question, but it's to get you connected with one another so that, again, you can take note if there's someone that you would like to follow up with, that you please can do that by getting in touch with them. So last reminder is to help the group include all voices there who are present and want to talk. So please be sure to share that airtime with everyone. So I am going to now open up these groups. I'm going to stop recording. Thank you to those watching this later.